guys, how's it going? It's Janie over here at Janie Sweets. Welcome back to another Friday Fixes episode where you ask me your cake questions and I do my best to answer them for you. Today's episode is going to focus on the science behind baking the perfect vanilla cake that is both awesome for eating because it is super sweet, tender, and moist, but also is great for stacking because it is super strong and sturdy. So if you want to learn my tips and tricks on how to get this recipe perfect every time, please keep on watching. What I want to focus on here in this video is not so much just giving you the recipe that I follow, but talking to you guys about what each ingredient does, because once you understand the science behind it, I think it's easier to tweak around and make the recipe your own. So if you want it to be a little bit more this, then you add a little bit more of that, if that makes sense. Let's talk about the materials that you're going to need for this recipe. The most expensive one here is going to be your stand mixer. Now, I do recommend a stand mixer because we're going to be using a method that is called the reverse mixing method. So if you're not familiar with that, don't worry. I will go in depth and explain to you guys what this is. But with that method, you are going to have to beat a lot of ingredients together for quite some time. So using your hands is not really gonna cut it. So you definitely want to invest in a good stand mixer. It doesn't have to be a KitchenAid. This just happens to be what I have, but there are some great stand mixers out there that are very, very inexpensive. I will link a few for you guys below if you're interested in purchasing one if you don't have one. Now, with that being said, you are going to use the paddle attachment for this recipe. You don't want the whisk and you don't want the dough hook. The next most important ingredient here, or material here, is going to be your kitchen scale. Guys, I cannot stress this enough. You need a kitchen scale. In order to get this recipe right, you're not going to be able to do it using cups or metric systems. So please, before anyone does, do not DM me. I cannot give you this recipe in cups or in metric system. Listen to me. Get a kitchen scale. I will link for you guys, you know, the kitchen scale that I use if I can still find it, because I bought this like years ago. They're literally so inexpensive. I don't understand why everybody doesn't own one. The next thing we're going to need is a sieve. Now, I have this pretty fancy one that I got from Michael's a very long time ago, but you can just use a regular kitchen sieve and that's going to be just fine. Now, the reason why you definitely need to make sure you sift your ingredients is not only is it going to aerate the dry ingredients, so it's going to, you know, incorporate a lot of air in it, but also in the packaging there might be some lumps and bumps and different things that you don't necessarily want to include in your cake. And because this is going to be a foolproof method, you want to make sure that you have definitely sifted all of your dry ingredients so that that doesn't happen. The last thing is it also makes sure that you incorporate everything very evenly. So once you put all your dry ingredients together, if you just kind of stir them around, there might be pockets of something here and there in the mixture, but sifting all of them together ensures that everything is very nicely incorporated. Now, the next three things are not that important, but you can have them if you wish, and that is a spatula, and that is going to scrape your bowl while you're mixing everything to make sure that nothing gets stuck at the bottom or on the side. So if you have one, that is great. The next thing is a whisk, and that's just to make sure that, you know, all of your wet ingredients are incorporated nicely. And then the very last thing is a little measuring cup or teaspoon, tablespoon measurement. That's going to be for any kind of flavorings that you want to add, like vanilla extract or butter extract or anything like that. Now that we have assembled all of our material, let's go through the ingredients. Ingredients are not very complicated. They're very basic. Most basic vanilla cake will have this list of ingredients. So I'm going to categorize them into 3 sections. Now the first section is what is going to provide structure to your cake. So that's going to be your flour and your eggs. Now before anyone asks, let's talk about flour for a second. I know a lot of people are going to ask, you know, what kind of flour do you recommend using in substitution to cake flour? And I honestly would not recommend any other substitution for cake flour. The reason being is that it has a low protein content in cake flour. So that's going to produce a super moist and delicate cake that falls apart in your mouth, if you will. So if you can use high ratio cake flour, go ahead and use it because it will make a difference in your recipe. If you do not have cake flour in the region where in the area where you live, you can substitute cake flour for something else. Be advised that I have done that and it does vary a little bit. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. It's not like using all-purpose flour, but it's not quite like using cake flour either. If you can, get the cake flour. If you cannot, here is the conversion. So however much cake flour you are going to add into your batter to make your batter, you're going to add the same amount of all-purpose flour, remove 1/4 of it, and then add in some cornstarch, if that makes any sense. The second set of structural ingredients are your eggs. Now your eggs, they do 2 things. You have your whites. The protein in the whites are going to provide the structure and stability of your cake, and the yolks, not only do they have a little bit of protein that is also going to contribute to the structure of the cake, they have fat in them. And now the fat is going into a different category that I like to call the tenderizers. Now your tenderizers are what are going to make your cake feel velvety and smooth when you're eating it. A lot of times people think that their cake is dry, but it's not so much dry that it's just not tender enough. So a very interesting trick that I learned a long time ago is if you find that your cakes tend to be dry or feel like they're dry, add in 2 egg yolks. So for one of that recipe that I'm going to share with you, just add in 2 egg yolks, just the yolks, not the whites, and you are going to notice a difference. It's gonna be very flavorful because of the fat, so fat carries flavor. So it's gonna be very flavorful, very tender, like you are not gonna understand what just happened, and all you did is just add 2 egg yolks to the recipe. Moving on to the next tenderizer, that is butter. Now butter is the king, I would say, of all of the tenderizers here. You definitely want to make sure that the butter is at room temperature because it is going to incorporate a lot nicer. When I explain to you guys what the reverse mixing method is, you're gonna understand why you need your butter at room temperature, because you want that butter to incorporate very nicely into your ingredients. The next tenderizer is sugar. Now that not only is sugar going to add a sweetness element, I mean cake's supposed to be sweet, and that's what's gonna make you wanna eat it, but it also adds moisture along with the tenderness because sugar attracts water molecules. So it's going to attract those water molecules, hold on to them, and make sure that your cake stays moist and delicious. Now be careful with the sugar because adding too much sugar into the recipe is going to cause your cake to concave and not stay strong enough. Last tenderizer here is going to be oil. Now oil is kind of like butter, it does the same thing. The only thing is that butter in this recipe, once you put it in the fridge, it is going to solidify and make the cake strong, which is why this cake is perfect for stacking, because once you refrigerate it, it gets strong. Not hard, just strong. It's hard to explain what I'm trying to say. It's just going to be very structurally sound. But to combat that, you want to add a little bit of oil. So most of those recipes, they just ask for butter. So what you do here in this recipe is you remove 1/4 of the butter and you replace it with oil. Now the last set of ingredients are your leaveners and flavor enhancers. Now salt is a great flavor enhancer. If you have ever cooked anything, it could have all the spices in the world. If it's missing salt, it's missing something. The salt is what is going to kind of like carry everything, you know, home. Now you can say, well, why don't you just add or why don't you just use salted butter as opposed to unsalted butter and then adding salt? Well, that's because you want to kind of control how much salt is going to go into your cake. It's not supposed to be a savory dish, it's a sweet dish. So just a little pinch of salt into this recipe is going to carry the flavors perfectly. Now leaveners, the way to elevate the cake to make sure that the cake rises and gets fluffy, there's different ways that you can do it. There's a way that you can whip up your egg whites, and that is going to, you know, create the leveling. Oh, I can't say that word. Levener, whatever, you get it. It's gonna make the cake inflate and become fluffy. But in this specific recipe, we are going to use baking powder, not to be confused with baking soda. They're two different things and they do two complete different things in your recipe. I used to have a hard time differentiating between the two. Now, how I kind of learned how to make the difference is by thinking of baking powder making things puffy, like powder puff. So whenever I'm at the bakery store or at the grocery store, I'm like, powder puff. I know that's kind of weird, but now it's in your mind and you're never going to forget it. Baking powder makes things puffy. Baking soda are going to tenderize things. So in this recipe, you do not need any baking soda. Some recipes do ask for it, but just put it to the side for now. So for this recipe, you are going to add all of your dry ingredients together. So that's your sugar, that's your flour, and that's your baking powder. Everything goes into the bowl of your stand mixer. Give it kind of like a stir just to get everything mixed together. But remember, we've sifted our ingredients ahead of time, so that's not going to be an issue. But just, you know, pulse it a little bit just to make sure that everything is incorporated nicely. Once that is done, I am going to grab my butter. Now, making sure that my butter is at room temperature, I am going to add the butter a little bit at a time into my mixer on speed low until it is super nice and incorporated in your dry ingredients. Now, remember I told you guys that we are using the reverse mixing method here. This is why. For this recipe, because we're going to add in the water or the liquids afterwards, we don't want to drown the flour in the sugar. In the traditional mixing method, you add in your fat, which is your butter, in your sugar together, and then you cream it. Then you add in your flour. Then you add in your egg and then your flour. Now, as soon as the flour hits those egg whites, it starts forming gluten, believe it or not. And that's gonna make the cake, you know, a little bit more tough. So to combat that, we are going to make sure that the butter, which is the fat, coats the flour granules. Now I'm putting it in a little bit at a time like you see here, and I'm going to stop once the butter has coated all of the sugar granules. I'm going to show you what that looks like. If you've ever been on a beach and the water has hit the sand, this is the texture, if you will, that you're looking for. It's gonna look like wet sand. If you clump it in between your fingers, it's going to form kind of like a ball. So you wanna stop there and then start with your wet ingredients. Now your wet ingredients are your milk, oil, eggs, and your extract. Your milk and your eggs also have to be at room temperature. If they are not, because the butter is at room temperature, when you add in the cold milk and the cold eggs to your batter, it's going to separate. It's going to look like it curdled almost. So make sure that all of your ingredients are at room temperature just to avoid that. So once I've mixed all of my wet ingredients together, I am going to add 1/3 of that into my flour, sugar, and butter mixture. Now I'm going to stop once it is coated with my wet ingredients, and I'm going to crank up my mixer to a high speed. Now I'm going to let that mix for 2 minutes. Now the reason why you want to make sure that this happens is because, remember in the regular method, what we learned is that we put the sugar and the butter together and we just kind of let it whip and get it fluffy. That is what's going to create air pockets inside of your batter. That is going to help it to puff up and rise. If you do not do that in the creaming method, it's not gonna happen. So because we're not creaming the butter here, what we need to do is to make sure that we have a fluffy batter. So mixing this on high speed for 2 minutes, not 10 minutes, 2 minutes is going to ensure that we get the same results. Now do not fear, because we're using high ratio cake flour and because that flour has been coated with the butter, don't worry about mixing it too much. I know this is contrary to what we learn using the regular creaming method. You don't want to mix the batter too much, but don't worry, in this specific recipe, this is not going to happen. Your cake is not going to be tough. If anything, it's going to be super fluffy. I'm going to stop my mixer right here, and as you can see, my batter is super light, super fluffy. It almost looks like buttercream, like it looks whipped, if that makes sense. So once that is at that stage, I'm gonna start it again on a low speed and I'm gonna add the rest of my wet ingredients into it. A little bit at a time, just a slow stream. You could stop and scrape your bowl if you feel like it, just to make sure that there's nothing stuck at the bottom or on the side, just to make sure it's very nicely incorporated. Once you are done with that, you have a beautiful, fluffy, amazing batter. Now, you need to make sure that you pop this into the oven as soon as possible, because you don't want this to sit out for too long. It's going to start having chemical reactions and your cake can be different. Before I started making my cake, I went ahead and prepped my pan. This recipe that I'm giving you is going to be perfect for an 8-inch and a 6-inch pan, both each 3 layers. If you wish to make this into a single cake just for eating, you can half this recipe. It halves beautifully, and because you are measuring out all the ingredients, you're able to make it make a half recipe, and it will create a 7-inch cake, so 3 layers. You can also make this recipe into a 10-inch pan. Now the reason why I like this is because it's perfect for stacking. Normally you would stack an 8-inch, a 6-inch, a 10-inch, even a 12-inch. So I will write down below exactly how to double or triple or half the recipe to you know, make it fit into your pan. So I have prepared my pans using cake goop. Now if you don't know what cake goop is, it is literally the holy grail of all cake pan release. I'm going to link her recipe for cake goop down below so that you know how to make it. It's super simple to make, and I always use that for my pan release. I don't like to use things like Baker's Joy and whatnot because it tends to make around the cake brown a bit. I don't know why. Maybe it's the pan that I'm using, but I just don't like to use Baker's Joy. Along with the cake goop, what I like to use is a parchment paper at the bottom of my pan. So a 6-inch parchment paper goes into the 6-inch pans and the 8-inch parchment paper into the 8-inch pan. If you want to, you can roll out a piece of parchment paper, trace your pan onto the parchment paper, and then cut it out. Otherwise, if you are making an abundance of cakes all the time, I would suggest you just buy them pre-cut. They do sell them. I'll link it for you if you're interested on where I found mine. Grabbing that cake goop, I'm going to just use my hands. You can use a pastry brush if you want to, and I'm just going to go around the perimeter of the cake pan and ensuring that everything is nice and covered before I start pouring in my batter. Now this recipe makes 10 cups of batter. What I like to do is I do 2 cups in each 8-inch cakes, and then I do 1 cup in each 6-inch cake, and whatever extra I have, I will just add it randomly to you know, my the rest of my pans, and then make sure that everything is nice and even. You can weigh it out if you want to, but I just use a ladle and I just ladle it into my cup measurer, and then I just pour it into my pans like so. Most recipes call for an oven of 350 degrees. I personally like to bake at 325 just so that it doesn't brown. The sides of the cake in the middle gets cooked evenly. Also, to ensure that it cooks evenly, anything above a 6-inch I use a flour nail for, and the flour nails are just these little metal things that you can purchase from your cake supply store, and you just pop it right in the middle of your pan. For an 8-inch I use 1, for a 10-inch I use 2, and then for a 12-inch I use 3 flour nails in each cake pan. Once you've added your flour nails in, you can go ahead and pop it into your oven. Now again, my oven was preheating at 325 degrees, and in order to bake these cakes to completion, the 6 inches took 20 minutes and the 10 inches took and the 8 inches took about 25 minutes. Now once they were done, I removed them from the oven. I let them cool a little bit in their pans, and then I flipped it upside down onto a cooling rack to cool completely. You can let it cool in the pan 100% overnight. What I have done in the past is that I've just wrapped the pan, the top of the pan, with saran wrap, and I've popped it in the refrigerator, and the next day I just popped it out of the saran wrap or of the pan. So there you have it, guys. This is how I make my perfect vanilla cake that is awesome for snacking on and awesome for stacking for things like wedding cakes and carving also. So if you liked this video tutorial, definitely please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. If you did not like it, or if you have any feedback, you can give it a thumbs down and explain in the comments below. I'll definitely get back to you because I answer every single comment. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. I'm going to make a new video every single Friday. I will see you in the next one. Bye.